strop. I'll show you how I keep my knives and chisels sharp. So, this is my flux cut detail knife. I've been using this knife for probably almost 8 years now. This one knife, this is what I use the most out of my carving instruments. Now, here's the same knife, but brand new. It's maybe a little hard to see, but the cutting surface on the brand new knife is much thicker. That's because over the years, I've sharpened this a few times, and even just honing the knife against the strop here takes away some material. So you can really see down at the lower area here where there's this little curve. You can tell that the curve on the brand new knife is a bit longer than the curve on the old knife. The other thing you can see is the brand new knife has a nice shine to it. It's very glossy. Not many scratches in the blade, just my fingerprints. And the old knife, you can see a decent number of scratches. So that's actually from sharpening the knife against sharpening a stone. Over time you can get some dings, some dents, irregularities in the edge of the blade, and sometimes a strop is enough to kind of take those out, but if you have enough of them and if they are deep enough, it's best to use a sharpening stone and straighten your blade again. Anyway, with a strop, it's just a piece of wood, a flat piece of wood with leather. You just take your knife, put a little bit of pressure, and straight back. The reason this is gray and kind of looks grimy is because there's a strop compound. It's kind of like chalk that you put onto the leather. It actually starts off looking yellow. And it just adds some grit to the surface of the leather. And then you really know that it's taking off a bit of material from your knife because it goes from yellow to gray, black from the metal bits that are getting stuck. Every once in a while I'll clean this off and apply some more compound, but really it does the job just fine this way. So I'm going to make sure that the blade is flat. And you're reproducing the angle of the blade. If I were to hold the blade up at an angle like this, it would not be good because I'd start to round the edge of the blade, and my knife would become less functional for its cutting. I'll also use this strop for a chisel. Same idea. Put some pressure on the blade, make sure that it's flat. Just drag back. Put some pressure. Flip it. Do the other side. just taped these pieces of paper onto either two of the faces of the block. And this is called an orthogonal view. You're looking at the piece from one side and then turn it perpendicular. You're looking at it from the other side, so these planes are orthogonal to one another. I think that's the term, which means perpendicular. This plane is perpendicular to this plane. So really what this means is that when we look at it straight on in this direction, any wood that extends past the drawing here, we can remove, and it won't interfere with anything in this plane. If we can see it in this plane, we can remove it. So that would be like this part up here. I can remove that. A lot of this down here, back here. Same goes for this plane now. So all this area up to where the mandible begins, we can remove that. Now, in the past couple of videos, if you've seen them or if not, I've been going pretty slow at this process because it's always better to be more conservative and go slower than working right up to your limit point and then realizing you might have gone a little bit too far. It's best just to go slow, be conservative, play it safe. You can always take more away later. That being said, let's get to it. Now, the way that the grain is oriented on this piece is interesting. If I were to begin at my paper here and start carving backwards, the wood would split. You can see that's what happened here, and I kind of did that on purpose because I know I'm taking off a lot of wood here. I can split it. You can see it split there. But it's really less predictable than making clean cuts, so I'd prefer to come forward towards the paper because I can determine where the wood will split that way. Cuts that I'm doing right now, it's called a paring cut when you pull the knife towards your thumb. A lot of times in carving you do not want to move the knife towards any of your fingers, but a paring cut is actually a lot safer than it looks. Basically, the knife, if I hold my hand properly, the knife is going to hit up against the butt of my thumb here before the blade actually reaches my finger. If it slipped and did come down towards my thumb, I can stop it really easily. But still, I don't want to be putting a lot of pressure on the blade to move it through the wood. That's why it's really important to sharpen and to hone your blade. Now, I really should not have this thumb here because remains at the top of the original wood. You can kind of see that dark patch. Starting to kind of round out the shape of the skull, the top portion. But still, like, there's a lot of excess wood here. Now, this is called a push cut. It's kind of the opposite of a paring cut. When it comes to wood carving, you want to use your small muscles and not your big muscles. A lot of people, when they first start, they use their entire arm, their elbow joint, to push the knife. If you watch me, you'll notice that I never move my elbow joint. It's wrist movements, but also you use the thumb of your left hand to push the blade. That way, if your knife, your knife just can't slip. You're never gonna cut your other finger because nothing is propelling your knife that far. If you're using your elbow, you slip through the wood and your knife continues on. Because that's a big muscle, a big joint, it's got a long range of motion. If you just pivot on your thumb like this, you're not gonna go past this point. There's just really no way. This thumb is what's propelling your knife forward. You're pulling backwards with your wrist, fulcruming on your thumb, moving the front of the blade forward through the wood. Or you can actually push, but I like that fulcrum motion. It's a lot easier for me. There's a wrist motion. It gives you a lot of control. Part of the skull right here is called the zygomatic arch, and so I'm gonna leave this wood here in line with the zygomatic arch, and beneath it, around the angle of the mandible here, I'm gonna bring this wood inwards towards the angle of the mandible. ramus of the mandible on the left, which is also not drawn. It'll be around here. Between the two sides of the mandible, it's actually just open. You just have the mandible extending forward. Between them is open, filled with the floor of our mouth. So I can start to kind of rough that out. Again, I'm going to be super conservative, really just staying far away from where the actual bones will be, but giving myself an idea. Okay, now I'm going to continue with some roughing out of the back of the skull and the occipital bone here. I'm just going to continue to bring this wood down into line with the paper. Bearing cuts I like because it gives me a lot of control, but sometimes I need a bit more power in my stroke, and that's when I might turn my knife and use my thumb as a fulcrum. That actually gives me more power to cut through the wood because I'm turning my knife into a lever, and if the fulcrum is my thumb here, the back lever arm is a lot longer than the front lever arm, so it gives me a huge increase in power. As far as how my narrating is. I'd love to answer any questions that anyone has about carving or bony anatomy of the skull. I could talk about anything. I guess in this video I've been going heavy on cutting technique, if you'd like less demonstration and more to the point carving, I can do that. That's fine. Just let me know. On the bottom part here. I need to make sure kind of even across on the other side. I like how that's looking. Alright, so here's where the angle of our mandible is. The ramus comes up pretty straight. This here is actually cut out of the mastoid process right here. But what you can see is got a lot of wood extending out past where the mandible is. So I need to take off a lot of this wood back here. It's thick, so I'm going to use my chisel. Just make some downward cuts across the grain. And it just loosens up this wood. It just fractures right off. It's nice, you can hear those cross grain cuts pretty well. Okay. Now, I'm gonna round off the back part here a little bit. His skull's way too while I'm doing these cuts. All of my cuts are going across the grain and never against the grain. A cut like this would be with the grain. A cut like this, perpendicular, would be across the grain. Against the grain is when you angle your blade towards the grain fibers, like the grain is coming straight in this direction. If I put my blade against the grain fibers like that, that's when I would cause the wood to split. So all of my cuts are going in the same direction as the grain, but also across the grain. My blade is perpendicular to the grain. My cuts are in the same direction as the grain. Obviously I'm just pretty much freehanding it here, but I'll make sure to take a look at my drawing every once in a while. I do think it's fairly obvious though when there's an angle that's too sharp. Like right here. I can definitely take that down. Round it out. So the very, very back of the skull is going to be a point, probably around right here. So everything else in this area will be carved down and converge on a point around here. There's also a part of the skull called the occipital tubercle around here where muscles attach. Your neck muscles attaching. But still, it's a little further forward than the very back of the skull. As much carving as we're doing, it can't hurt to every once in a while own the blade. very square looking. This skull is a little bit of a challenge to myself because I've never really carved something organic. My fascination has generally in the past been with more like geometrical figures with pretty delineated points. I can show a couple of them. One example is a project we're working on for the other playlist, the interlocking rings. Here's another example of interlocking rings. 4 cloverleaf shapes that are interlocking. This project will be a ball in a cage. Locked pyramids. And so with these projects, though, you can see they're a lot more angular. The shapes are very defined. You can plan them out quite a bit. And then at that point, it's just cutting away what doesn't belong. But the shape like a skull is much more organic, and there aren't necessarily exact points where that you can use for reference. Like the entire skull is round, so it just takes a bit of time, I think, to round these corner areas. That's something I don't have a ton of practice with. I mean, it's similar to, let's say, rounding the rings of a piece like this. But it takes a little bit of time, it takes a lot of patience, and that's fine. I just hope it doesn't annoy you guys too much. How slow I'm going on this project. Hopefully, you're content just enjoying the sounds. this area. I'm carving right down to where the zygomatic arch begins. Right here. I can remove all the wood up till that point. Still, we're up towards where the temporal bone is. We're not quite yet down far enough to actually be thinking about the zygomatic arch down here. That's fine. So it looks like we've about made it through another video with these papers still in place. But this one's getting pretty ratty down here, so perhaps before the next episode I'll change them up, clean things up a little bit. Sorry, I was drifting off screen a little bit there. The other thing I'm not super used to with a piece like this, with it being a skull, is that it's not symmetrical. Most of the other things I'm used to carving are very symmetrical, so it's just unusual to have to think about different patterns on every side of your block. So here, I'm kind of carving towards the chin in a V shape, because that's the shape that the mandibular bones create. Anyway, I appreciate you sticking around. I hope you enjoyed the